The year is 1943. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly beneath a moonless sky. In the distance, the rumble of diesel engines breaks the silence. Small wooden boats, no longer than 80 feet, cut through black water at speeds exceeding 40 knots. These are America's PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, and tonight they're about to change the course of naval warfare forever. For centuries, naval supremacy belonged to whoever commanded the biggest guns and the heaviest armor. Battleships were the undisputed masters of the sea, floating fortresses whose very presence could alter the course of wars. But in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands, a new kind of warfare was emerging. One where speed, stealth, and audacity could overcome raw firepower. One where a handful of young Americans in plywood boats would challenge the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy and rewrite the rules of sea combat. This is the story of how American PT boats didn't just sink enemy vessels. They shattered an entire strategic doctrine that had governed Japanese naval thinking since the Meiji Restoration. They forced an empire to rethink everything it knew about controlling the seas. And they did it not through superior firepower or larger numbers, but through innovation, courage, and a willingness to fight a kind of war that no one had truly fought before. Let's go back to understand what the Japanese Navy believed before these encounters. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting what they called the decisive battle doctrine. It was simple, elegant, and had roots stretching back to Admiral Togo's crushing victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905. The concept was straightforward. Build the most powerful battleships, concentrate your fleet, and destroy the enemy in one massive climactic engagement that would decide control of the Pacific in a single afternoon. Every ship, every sailor, every strategic decision was built around this singular vision. The Japanese constructed the Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, with 18-inch guns that could obliterate anything afloat from distances exceeding 25 miles. Each of these leviathans displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded and carried a crew of over 2,000 men. They trained their sailors in night fighting until they were the best in the world, conducting endless exercises under conditions that would have terrified other navies. They developed the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, faster and more powerful than anything in the American arsenal, capable of running at 49 knots for 11 miles, while carrying a warhead that weighed over 1,000 pounds. Japanese naval officers studied the classics of naval warfare, from Nelson's tactics at Trafalgar to Togo's crossing of the T at Tsushima. They developed complex battle plans that called for coordinated attacks by destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, all converging on the enemy at precisely calculated moments. Their gunnery training was so intensive that Japanese heavy crews could maintain accurate fire at targets 20 miles away while maneuvering at high speed. Their torpedo squadrons practiced attack runs until they could execute them in complete darkness, with no illumination whatsoever. But there was a problem with this doctrine that the Japanese High Command had never seriously considered. What happens when the enemy refuses to fight your decisive battle? What happens when instead of meeting you head-on with battleships in broad daylight, they send small, fast boats that strike from the darkness and vanish before you can respond? What happens when warfare becomes not about the clash of titans, but about denying the enemy the ability to use the sea at all? The Japanese had faced small boat attacks before. During their expansion through Southeast Asia and the Philippines, they'd encountered British and American motor torpedo boats. In the narrow waters around Singapore, British boats had made desperate attacks against Japanese invasion convoys. In the Philippines, a handful of American PT boats had harassed Japanese forces. But these were isolated incidents, desperate last stands by forces that were already defeated. The Japanese sank them easily and moved on. Small boats were an annoyance, not a threat, or so they thought. They had no doctrine for dealing with sustained small boat warfare because they simply couldn't imagine it would matter. The American PT boat program began modestly, almost hesitantly. Before Pearl Harbor, the US Navy was deeply skeptical about small, fast attack boats. They seemed too fragile, too limited in range, too vulnerable. The battleship admirals who dominated the Navy's leadership couldn't see how wooden boats carrying a handful of torpedoes could contribute to winning a naval war. They pointed to the limited success of similar boats in World War I and argued that the future belonged to big ships with big guns. But a few forward-thinking officers saw potential. They looked at what the British were doing with their motor torpedo boats in the Mediterranean, where British boats were successfully attacking Italian and German shipping in the confined waters between Sicily and North Africa. They studied the Italian MAS boats that had successfully attacked Austrian battleships in World War I, including the famous raid on Polar Harbour, where two small boats sank the battleship St. Istvan. They examined reports from observers who had watched Soviet torpedo boats operating in the Baltic. When war came, the United States found itself desperately short of everything. Building battleships and aircraft carriers took years. A single Essex-class aircraft carrier required over 3 years from laying the keel to commissioning. Battleships took even longer, but PT boats? They could be constructed in months, using materials that weren't competing with other critical war production. The boats required wood, gasoline engines, and relatively simple weapon systems. Most importantly, they could be built in small boatyards all along the American coast, not just in the major naval shipyards that were already overwhelmed with contracts. Elco and Higgins, the primary manufacturers, set up production lines that could turn out these boats at an astonishing rate. Elco's facility in Bayonne, New Jersey, became the world's largest manufacturer of wooden boats, employing thousands of workers who turned out PT boats with assembly line efficiency. Andrew Jackson Higgins in New Orleans brought his experience building boats for oil prospectors in the Louisiana bayous to create vessels that were rugged, practical, and surprisingly fast. The competition between these two manufacturers drove innovation and improvements in design. The early PT boats were crude by later standards, but represented cutting-edge technology for small craft. Powered by 3 Packard Vi-12 engines, the same basic design used in luxury automobiles, generating 4,500 horsepower total, they could reach speeds of 41 knots in calm seas. That's nearly 48 miles per hour, extraordinary for any vessel in rough ocean conditions. The engines were mounted side by side in the engine room, connected to 3 propellers through reduction gears. The noise inside a PT boat at full speed was deafening, a shrieking roar that made conversation impossible and left crews partially deaf after long patrols. They were armed with 4 Mark 8 torpedoes mounted in tubes on the deck. Each torpedo weighed over 3,000 pounds and could theoretically sink any ship afloat. They carried multiple 50 caliber machine guns mounted on rotating pedestals, and later, a 37mm cannon mounted on the foredeck. The hull was made of 2 layers of mahogany planking over white oak frames, chosen not for armor, but for speed and ease of repair. The entire boat weighed only 56 tons fully loaded, less than a single main gun turret on a battleship. Inside, conditions were Spartan. The crew of 12 to 14 men worked in cramped quarters where everything was soaked with spray, vibrating constantly and reeking of gasoline fumes. There was no galley, just a small area where coffee could be heated on a stove that usually didn't work in rough seas. There was no real sleeping accommodation, just bunks that were constantly damp. The head was a bucket. Navigation was primitive, relying on compass, charts, and dead reckoning. Radio communication was unreliable at best. These boats needed special men to crew them. The Navy looked for officers and sailors who were young, aggressive, and unconventional. They found them everywhere from Ivy League colleges to fishing docks. Harvard and Yale graduates served alongside men who had grown up running fishing boats out of Gloucester or shrimpers out of the Gulf Coast. What united them was a willingness to take enormous risks and an ability to think independently. PT boat crews couldn't wait for orders from distant admirals. They operated in small groups, often out of radio contact, making life or death decisions in seconds based on nothing more than intuition and experience. The ideal PT boat officer was between 22 and 28 years old, had excellent eyesight, particularly night vision, possessed quick reflexes, and most importantly, had the kind of aggressive temperament that made him seek out combat rather than avoid it. The Navy wanted men who would drive their boats straight at enemy destroyers, men who would maintain course even when Japanese searchlights pinned them and shells were churning up the water around them. They wanted men who could make split-second decisions about when to attack and when to withdraw, and who could live with the consequences of those decisions. The training was intense and unforgiving. At bases in Rhode Island, Florida, and later in the Pacific, Crews learned to handle their boats in all conditions. They practiced night navigation without lights, learning to steer by the stars and the phosphorescence of their wake. They ran torpedo attacks against moving targets, learning the complex calculations needed to predict where a ship would be when the torpedo arrived. They practiced formation keeping in complete darkness, learning to maintain station on other boats that were invisible except for the faint glow of their exhaust. They learned how to coax maximum speed from engines that were constantly on the edge of breaking down, how to nurse a damaged engine back to base, how to change spark plugs in complete darkness while under fire. They learned that in combat, their greatest weapons weren't torpedoes but darkness and surprise. A PT boat caught in daylight by enemy aircraft was almost defenseless. Its wooden hull could be shredded by machine gun fire. Its gasoline tanks could be set ablaze by a single incendiary round. But at night, low in the water, painted black or dark grey with all lights extinguished, a PT boat became almost invisible. Japanese lookouts trained to spot large ships would look right past PT boats, unable to distinguish them from waves or shadows. By 1942, PT boats were arriving in the Pacific Theater in increasing numbers. Their first operations were defensive and often desperate, evacuating troops from the Philippines as the Japanese advanced. General Douglas MacArthur himself was evacuated from Corregidor aboard PT boats, transferred to a submarine, and taken to Australia. It was during these early operations that PT boats earned their first combat experience and learned their first hard lessons about what worked and what didn't. It was during one of these missions that a young lieutenant named John F. Kennedy took command of PT-109. Kennedy was typical of the PT boat officers, young, from a wealthy background, well-educated, and looking for action. He'd pulled strings to get assigned to PT boats after spending months on desk duty in Washington. But the real story of PT boats isn't about any single boat or commander. It's about how a new form of warfare evolved through trial, error, and the blood of countless young sailors who learned lessons that sometimes killed them. The Solomon Islands became the proving ground. This chain of jungle-covered islands southeast of Papua New Guinea became one of the war's most contested regions. The islands themselves seemed cursed, covered in dense jungle, surrounded by coral reefs, plagued by malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery. They were among the most unpleasant places on Earth to fight a war, but their strategic location made them vital. Control of the Solomons meant control of sea lanes to Australia and New Guinea. Lose the Solomons and the Japanese could cut the lifeline between America and the Southwest Pacific. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they triggered a 6-month battle that would determine control of the entire South Pacific. The island itself became a meat grinder where Marines and soldiers fought Japanese troops in conditions that defied description. But equally important was the struggle for control of the surrounding waters. Ships brought supplies, reinforcements, and ammunition. Ships evacuated wounded. Ships made the difference between victory and defeat. The waters around the Solomons, particularly the stretch known as the Slot, became a nightly battleground. The Slot was a water passage running northwest to southeast between two parallel chains of islands. It was approximately 50 miles wide and over 200 miles long, a natural highway for ships moving between the major Japanese base at Rabaul and the contested islands to the south. The Japanese controlled the air during the day, but American aircraft operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal made Japanese ship movements almost impossible in daylight. Any Japanese ship caught in the Slot during the day faced swarms of American bombers. So the Japanese developed what American sailors grimly called the Tokyo Express, or the Rat Run. Fast destroyers, sometimes accompanied by cruisers, would race down the Slot at night, deliver troops and supplies to Japanese garrisons on Guadalcanal and other islands, and race back before dawn. These runs were executed with clockwork precision. Japanese destroyers would arrive at their destination just after midnight, spend less than an hour unloading, and be well on their way back before American aircraft could arrive at dawn. The Japanese chose destroyers for these runs because they were fast, capable of over 35 knots, and heavily armed enough to fight their way through any opposition. They also developed special techniques for rapid unloading. Supplies were packed in watertight containers that could be thrown overboard near shore, where Japanese troops would wade out and retrieve them. Troops were landed in landing craft, or simply made to swim ashore if time was critical. The entire operation was conducted with lights out, using only brief hooded flashlights when absolutely necessary. This was where PT boats found their purpose. American cruisers and destroyers were often outnumbered and outgunned in night surface actions against the Tokyo Express. The Japanese had superior night optics, oxygen-powered torpedoes that left no wake, and more experience in night fighting. American surface forces suffered devastating defeats in battles like Savo Island, where the Japanese sank 4 American cruisers in a single night in August 1942, the worst naval defeat in American history. The Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942 saw the Japanese sink 1 American cruiser and damage 3 more while losing only a single destroyer. But PT boats operated differently. They didn't need to win stand-up fights against destroyers or cruisers. They didn't have to match the Japanese in night fighting techniques. They had different advantages and used different tactics. They hid in island coves during the day, camouflaged under palm fronds and netting, their crews sleeping or performing maintenance. Then, as darkness fell, they would emerge like sea wolves, taking up positions along likely routes for Japanese ships. Their low profile made them almost invisible on Japanese radar, which was inferior to American systems anyway, and had trouble picking up small targets against the background clutter of islands. Their wooden hulls didn't show up well on radar, even when detected, unlike the steel hulls of larger ships that reflected radar waves strongly, and their speed meant they could attack and escape before the enemy could bring superior firepower to bear. A PT boat could be alongside an enemy destroyer, fire its torpedoes, and be racing away into the darkness in less than a minute. The early attacks were learning experiences, often painful ones. PT boat crews discovered that their torpedoes, the Mark 8th, were unreliable in ways that were deeply frustrating and sometimes fatal. They ran too deep, passing underneath targets without hitting. Their magnetic exploders, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel where the explosion would break its back, often failed to work. Contact exploders weren't much better, frequently failing to detonate even when the torpedo struck the target squarely. And they were slower than Japanese torpedoes, giving targets more time to maneuver. Boats would make perfect attacks, approaching unseen, achieving ideal firing position, launching torpedoes at point-blank range, and then watching in horror as torpedoes passed underneath targets or struck without exploding. One boat commander reported firing 4 torpedoes at a stopped Japanese transport from a range of only 300 yards. All 4 torpedoes hit, none exploded. The transport, now fully alert, opened fire with everything it had, while the PT boat raced away through a storm of shells and tracers. These failures weren't just frustrating, they were deadly. Every torpedo attack exposed the PT boat to return fire. The sound of torpedo motors running gave away the boat's position. The wake of the torpedoes pointed straight back to where the boat had fired from. And if the torpedoes didn't sink the target, that target would be fully alert and fighting mad. Japanese destroyers would charge toward where the attack had come from, searchlights blazing, guns firing, determined to sink the attackers. Frustrated crews began to rely more on their guns, using torpedoes only when they had ideal setups against high-value targets. They discovered that their .50 caliber machine guns, while useless against destroyers or cruisers, were devastating against smaller craft. They could shred wooden barges, destroy landing craft, and kill exposed personnel on ship decks. The 37mm cannon could punch holes in thin-skinned vessels and set fires that would consume entire boats. But they kept learning. They discovered that Japanese destroyers, despite their fearsome reputations, had blind spots. The tall pagoda-like superstructures that gave Japanese lookouts excellent visibility also created radar shadows and visual dead zones. These superstructures, rising 50 feet or more above the waterline, blocked the view of lookouts when looking down at the water close to the ship. PT boats learned to approach from these blind spots, staying close to islands where their boat's profile merged with the land, using every island, every reef, every shadow to conceal their approach. They learned to work in pairs or small groups. One boat would create a distraction, perhaps by firing machine guns or setting off smoke, while others attacked from different angles. This divided the enemy's attention and made it much harder for Japanese ships to defend against multiple threats. They learned that the ideal attack was at close range, sometimes as close as 500 yards, where even unreliable torpedoes had a good chance of hitting, and where the PT boat could escape into darkness before the enemy recovered from surprise. They learned that after firing torpedoes, they should reverse course immediately, accelerating to maximum speed and using smoke generators to create confusion while they escaped. These smoke generators, installed in the engine room, could create thick white smoke that billowed from the stern, hiding the boat's wake and confusing pursuers about which direction the boat had gone. Japanese destroyers, charging toward where they thought the attack had come from, would find only smoke and empty water, while the PT boats raced away at 40 knots. They learned to read the sea and the sky. They could tell from the sound of engines and the configuration of lights whether a Japanese ship was a destroyer, cruiser, or transport. They learned to judge speed and bearing from the ship's wake and the angle of its mast lights. They learned to navigate through reef-strewn waters in complete darkness, using their knowledge of currents, the sound of waves breaking on coral, and sometimes nothing more than intuition. The Japanese began to notice something troubling. Their Tokyo Express runs were becoming increasingly hazardous. Destroyers reported encounters with small, fast boats that appeared from nowhere, fired torpedoes or raked them with gunfire, and vanished before effective return fire could be brought to bear. At first, these reports were dismissed or minimized. How could boats made of wood threaten steel destroyers displacing 2,000 tons and armed with multiple gun turrets? How could boats crewed by a dozen men challenge ships crewed by hundreds? But the attacks continued and intensified. In October 1942, PT boats scored their first confirmed kill of a Japanese warship when PT-60, commanded by Lieutenant Herbert Knight, torpedoed and sank a Japanese patrol craft near Guadalcanal. It was a small victory. The vessel was only a converted fishing boat, but it proved the concept. More importantly, it showed Japanese commanders that American small boats were more than just an annoyance. They could kill. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, PT boat squadrons expanded their operations systematically. New bases were established on small islands throughout the Solomons, each one pushing the reach of PT boats further into what had been Japanese-controlled waters. These weren't comfortable rear area installations with proper docks and facilities. They were primitive camps hacked out of jungle, within range of Japanese artillery and air attacks. Bases consisted of a few tents, a fuel depot made from 55-gallon drums, a small dock or ramp where boats could be pulled up for repairs, and not much else. Crews lived in tents that were constantly damp from tropical humidity. They worked on their boats under camouflage nets, knowing that Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over regularly and that discovery meant air attack. They went to sea every night there was a possibility of Japanese ship movements, which meant almost every night. There were no nights off, no liberty, no respite from the constant cycle of preparation, patrol, combat, and repair. The conditions were brutal in ways that are hard to imagine today. The tropical heat was oppressive, with temperatures regularly exceeding 95 degrees and humidity approaching 100%. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery struck down more men than Japanese action. At some bases, over half the personnel were sick at any given time. Malaria was particularly devastating, causing high fevers, chills, and hallucinations that could last for weeks. Men would lose 30 or 40 pounds, become skeletal shadows of themselves, and still insist on returning to duty before they'd fully recovered, because they didn't want to abandon their crews. The boats themselves required constant maintenance. Plywood hulls absorbed water and developed rot in the tropical environment. Seams opened up from the constant pounding of running at high speed through rough seas. Engines needed rebuilding after every few missions, with bearings replaced, valves adjusted, and fuel systems cleaned. Torpedoes had to be maintained in humid conditions, where they corroded rapidly. Gasoline had to be filtered repeatedly because dirt and water in the fuel would cause engine failures. Every gun had to be cleaned daily because salt spray caused them to rust overnight. Spare parts were chronically short. Engines designed for luxury automobiles were being run at maximum power for hours at a time, in conditions they were never designed for. They broke down regularly. Sometimes bases would cannibalize one boat to keep two others running. Crews became expert at improvising repairs with whatever materials were at hand. They made gaskets from leather boots, fashioned spare parts from salvaged Japanese equipment, and kept engines running through sheer ingenuity and determination. But morale remained surprisingly high despite the hardships. PT boat crews were volunteers. They'd chosen this duty knowing the risks. They'd chosen it specifically because it offered action, independence, and the chance to directly strike at the enemy. They developed a fierce pride in their boats and a competitive spirit with other squadrons. Each successful attack, each Japanese destroyer damaged or sunk, validated their existence and proved that their tactics worked. there was also something intoxicating about the life. These men, most in their early 20s, commanded their own boats. They made tactical decisions that would have required approval from multiple levels of command in any other context. When they went to sea, they were on their own. Radio communication was often impossible due to atmospheric conditions or the need for radio silence. They had to rely on their own judgment, their knowledge of the sea and the enemy, and their ability to work together as a crew. The crews developed bonds stronger than those in most military units. When you're in a wooden boat racing at 40 knots through darkness with Japanese shells falling around you, you learn very quickly who you can trust with your life. The officers and enlisted men who crewed PT boats lived together, ate together, and fought together in a way that broke down the normal barriers of military hierarchy. A PT boat captain might be a Harvard graduate from a wealthy family, but he trusted his life to his engine room machinist's mate, who might be a Texas farm boy with an 8th grade education and an intuitive understanding of how to keep temperamental engines running. The Japanese response evolved as they realized the PT boat threat was real and growing. They began assigning destroyers specifically to hunt PT boats, rather than just defend against them. These anti-PT boat patrols would sweep through waters where PT boats were known to operate, searchlights blazing, hoping to catch them out in the open. They equipped their ships with additional searchlights, mounted lower on the hull to illuminate the water surface more effectively. They added more machine guns and light cannons specifically to deal with small, fast targets. They developed tactics where destroyers would illuminate attacking PT boats with searchlights, and then either ram them or destroy them with overwhelming gunfire. This was terrifying for PT boat crews. A destroyer's searchlight was intensely bright, capable of illuminating targets over a mile away. When multiple searchlights focused on a PT boat, it turned night into day, blinding the crew and making the boat visible to every gun on the Japanese ship. And Japanese destroyers were significantly faster than PT boats in rough seas. In calm water, a PT boat could outrun a destroyer, but in the choppy conditions that were typical in the Solomons, destroyers had the advantage. Any PT boat caught in the open by an alert destroyer was in mortal danger. The destroyer would open fire with everything it had: 5-inch guns, 25mm cannons, 13mm machine guns. Shells and tracers would converge on the PT boat. The plywood hull offered no protection. A 5-inch shell could blow a PT boat in half. Even a near miss could shred the hull with shrapnel. And if the gasoline tanks were hit, the boat would explode in a fireball visible for miles. This led to some of the war's most desperate battles, running fights where PT boats would use every trick they knew to survive. On the night of August 1st, 1943, 15 PT boats were patrolling Blackett Strait when a group of Japanese destroyers came down the slot on a supply run. The PT boats were spread out along the strait in groups of 2 or 3, waiting in ambush positions. What should have been a coordinated attack dissolved into chaos within minutes. Communications broke down. Some boats never received the warning that Japanese ships were approaching. Others got the message but couldn't determine exactly where the destroyers were or which direction they were moving. Boats got separated from their division mates in the darkness, and the Japanese destroyers, moving at over 30 knots, covered the distance between divisions before the PT boats could properly organize an attack. PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant Kennedy, was idling on one engine to conserve fuel when the destroyer Amagiri appeared out of darkness less than 300 yards away. Kennedy tried to turn toward the destroyer to fire torpedoes, but there wasn't time. The Amagiri struck PT-109 amidships, cutting the boat in half. The forward section, containing Kennedy and most of the crew, remained afloat but was heavily damaged and filling with water. 2 crew members were killed instantly in the collision. The after section, containing the engine room and gasoline tanks, somehow didn't explode but quickly sank. Kennedy and the 10 survivors clung to the floating bow section for hours as it slowly sank. When it became clear the wreckage wouldn't stay afloat, they swam for a small island 3 miles away. Kennedy towed one badly burned crew member by holding a strap from the man's life jacket in his teeth and swimming for 5 hours. They reached the island at dawn, utterly exhausted. The island was tiny, barely 100 yards across, covered only with a few palm trees. There was no food and no fresh water. Over the next several days, Kennedy and his crew swam to other small islands, searching for help, while Japanese barges passed within yards of where they hid. But while Kennedy's survival story became famous, that same night other PT boats pressed their attacks despite the chaos. PT-159, commanded by Lieutenant Henry Brantingham, encountered the destroyers and immediately fired all 4 torpedoes at a range of 800 yards. At least one torpedo struck the destroyer Hagikaze, tearing a 40-foot hole in her bow and killing several crew members. The destroyer was forced to reduce speed and eventually withdrew from the action. PT-157 and PT-162, working together, coordinated an attack that forced 2 other Japanese destroyers to take violent evasive action, causing them to separate from the rest of the group and temporarily lose formation. The Japanese destroyers, confused and under attack from multiple directions, never completed their supply mission properly. They failed to unload at their primary destination and instead dumped supplies at an alternate location where many were lost or damaged. They returned to base having failed their mission and with one destroyer requiring extensive repairs. From the Japanese perspective, the entire operation had been a costly failure. This was becoming a pattern that deeply frustrated Japanese naval commanders. Even when PT boats didn't sink ships, they disrupted Japanese operations. A Tokyo Express run that should have taken a few hours and been a routine operation now required extensive planning, detailed intelligence about PT boat dispositions, and elaborate evasive maneuvers. Destroyers had to spend precious fuel zigzagging and taking evasive action. They had to detach vessels from the main group to hunt for PT boats, reducing the carrying capacity of each run. They had to slow down in areas where PT boats might be waiting, extending the time they spent in dangerous waters and increasing the chance they'd still be within range of American aircraft at dawn. Some runs had to be cancelled entirely because intelligence suggested heavy PT boat activity along the route. Other runs were redirected to alternate landing sites that were less convenient and more difficult to supply from. The cumulative effect was that Japanese garrisons in the Solomons received less food, less ammunition, fewer reinforcements, and less equipment than they needed. This directly affected their ability to fight. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal began starving. Some resorted to eating grass and tree bark. Units that should have had ample ammunition for offensive operations found themselves rationing bullets. The strategic impact was becoming clear to senior commanders on both sides. The Japanese had built their entire Pacific strategy on their ability to move forces rapidly by sea. Their island garrisons depended utterly on naval supply. Their doctrine of offensive operations, of concentrating forces at the decisive point, required maritime mobility. PT boats were systematically disrupting all of this, not through dramatic victories, but through cumulative attrition. Japanese naval commanders faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't ignore the PT boat threat without abandoning their garrisons to starvation and defeat. But responding to the threat required resources they desperately needed elsewhere. Every destroyer assigned to anti-PT boat patrols was one less destroyer available for fleet operations or convoy escort. Japan was already short of destroyers. They'd lost many in the early months of the war, and their shipbuilding industry couldn't replace them quickly enough. Devoting precious destroyers to hunting plywood boats seemed wasteful, but failing to do so meant watching supply runs fail repeatedly. Every ship that took damage from PT boat attacks required repair time that the Japanese couldn't afford. Japan's naval repair facilities were already overwhelmed with damaged ships from fleet actions and submarine attacks. Adding more damaged vessels to the queue meant longer wait times for everything. A destroyer with a torpedo hole in its bow might require 3 months to repair. During that time, it was completely useless. If multiple destroyers were damaged, the effect on the fleet was significant. Japan's industrial capacity was already stretched thin. They couldn't replace losses the way America could. American shipyards were launching new destroyers every month, new cruisers every few weeks, new carriers regularly. Japanese shipyards were struggling to keep up with repairs, let alone build new ships. Every destroyer sunk or damaged by PT boats was a loss that might not be replaced for a year or more. Every ton of supplies lost to PT boat attacks was a ton that had to be replaced from Japan's limited stockpiles. The Japanese tried several solutions, each with its own problems. They experimented with armored barges that could withstand PT boat gunfire. These barges, essentially small landing craft heavily reinforced with steel plate, could carry supplies and troops while being relatively immune to machine gun fire. But they were slow, capable of only 8 or 9 knots, which meant they took all night to make trips that destroyers could complete in a few hours. And while they could withstand gunfire, they were still vulnerable to torpedoes. PT boats learned to save torpedoes for these armored barges, sinking them with single hits. They tried using submarines to supply isolated garrisons, Japanese submarines could slip past PT boat patrols and deliver supplies directly to besieged troops. But submarines were too valuable and too few to waste on supply runs. Japan needed every submarine for attacks on American carriers and battleships. Using them as cargo vessels was an admission of desperation, and submarines could carry very limited cargo compared to destroyers. A destroyer might carry hundreds of troops and tons of supplies. A submarine might carry a few tons at most. They tried air supply, flying transport aircraft to drop supplies by parachute or landing on rough airstrips. But American air power made this increasingly suicidal. American fighters patrolled the skies over the Solomons constantly. Japanese transport aircraft were slow and vulnerable. Entire formations were shot down, losing not just the aircraft and supplies, but also the irreplaceable crews. After losing dozens of transports in a matter of weeks, the Japanese had to admit that air supply wasn't sustainable. Meanwhile, PT boat tactics continued to evolve rapidly as crews learned from each engagement. By mid-1943, boats were being equipped with radar sets, primitive by modern standards, but revolutionary for small boats. These radar sets, usually the SO model, could detect ships at ranges up to 7 or 8 miles depending on the size of the target and sea conditions. This gave PT boats an enormous advantage in night operations. They could detect Japanese ships long before the Japanese could see them. They could track targets, determine their course and speed, and set up perfect ambushes, all while remaining invisible themselves. New boats were being built with improved engines, better hull designs incorporating lessons learned from earlier models, and better armament. The Packard engines were upgraded with better cooling systems, more reliable ignition systems, and improved fuel systems. Hull designs were refined to handle rough seas better and to be more maneuverable at high speed. More importantly, crews were becoming veterans, developing an instinctive understanding of how to fight in the dark waters of the Pacific. The boats began working more closely with intelligence sources, transforming from independent raiders into a coordinated anti-shipping force. Coast watchers, brave individuals, both European and native islanders, positioned throughout the Solomons, would radio reports of Japanese ship movements. They would count ships, identify types, note course and speed, and transmit this information to PT boat bases. Native islanders working with the Allies provided invaluable local knowledge about currents, reefs, and places where PT boats could hide. Submarines patrolling off major Japanese bases would report when enemy ships departed and in which direction they were heading. With this intelligence, PT boats could set up ambushes along likely routes rather than patrolling randomly hoping to encounter targets. If coast watchers reported 4 destroyers leaving Buin heading south at 30 knots, PT boats could calculate when those destroyers would reach certain choke points and position themselves accordingly. This transformed PT boat operations from reactive to proactive. Instead of stumbling into enemy ships by chance, they hunted them deliberately. Gun armament increased dramatically as crews learned that in many situations, guns were more effective than torpedoes. Early boats had been designed primarily as torpedo craft with machine guns purely for self-defense. But the unreliability of torpedoes and the variety of targets encountered led to a dramatic shift in armament philosophy. Boats started mounting multiple 50 caliber machine guns, sometimes as many as 8 or 10, giving them the ability to put up a wall of fire. They added 20mm Oerlikon cannons, excellent weapons with high rates of fire and good armor-piercing capability. They mounted 37mm guns that could penetrate the hulls of small craft and barges. Some boats even mounted 40mm Bofors cannons, originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons but deadly against surface targets. These guns could fire explosive shells at a high rate, destroying barges. The competition between Elco and Higgins was intense and sometimes bitter. Each company claimed their design was superior. Elco boats were generally considered more comfortable for the crew and had slightly better seakeeping in rough weather. Higgins boats were more maneuverable and easier to repair in the field. Navy officers had fierce debates about which design was better, debates that sometimes degenerated into actual arguments. In practice, both types served with distinction, and the differences mattered less than the skill and courage of the crews. The early PT boats, particularly the Elco 80-foot design that became the standard, were crude by later standards but represented cutting-edge technology for small craft. Powered by 3 Packard V12 marine engines, essentially the same basic design used in luxury automobiles, but marinized with better cooling and saltwater-resistant components. They generated a total of 4,500 horsepower. To put that in perspective, that's more horsepower than a World War II medium tank, all packed into a boat that weighed only 56 tons. The engines were mounted side by side in the engine room amidships, connected to 3 propellers through reduction gears. The center engine drove the center propeller, and the port and starboard engines drove their respective propellers. This configuration meant that losing one engine was survivable. The boat could limp home on 2 engines, though at greatly reduced speed. But it also meant that damage to the engine room could disable all 3 engines simultaneously. The noise inside a PT boat at full speed was deafening, a shrieking roar that made conversation impossible even with shouting. Crews communicated through hand signals or by tapping messages in Morse code on metal surfaces. After long patrols, crews would emerge partially deaf, their ears ringing for hours. Some veterans suffered permanent hearing loss. The vibration was intense as well, rattling every bolt and rivet, causing instruments to blur, making it difficult to read charts or gauges. The boats were armed with 4 Mark 8 torpedoes mounted in tubes on the deck, 2 tubes per side angled slightly outward. Each torpedo weighed over 3,000 pounds and measured 21 inches in diameter and over 20 feet long. The warhead contained approximately 600 pounds of TNT, enough to sink any ship if it hit a vital area. Theoretically, these torpedoes could travel at 36 knots for 6,000 yards, allowing attacks from what should have been a safe distance. Machine guns bristled from every available space. Early boats typically mounted 2 twin 50 caliber machine gun turrets, one forward and one aft, giving all-around coverage. Each 50 caliber gun could fire between 500 and 600 rounds per minute, out to effective ranges of a mile or more. The psychological effect of multiple 50 calibers firing simultaneously was enormous. Tracers would stream out in all directions, creating a cone of fire that looked impenetrable. The noise was overwhelming, and the amount of metal in the air was staggering. Later, boats added a 37mm cannon on the foredeck. This weapon, adapted from an Army anti-tank gun, fired explosive shells that could penetrate the hulls of small craft and barges. The rate of fire was relatively slow, about 30 rounds per minute, but each hit was devastating. The gun crew consisted of 3 men, a gunner who aimed and fired, a loader who fed shells, and a sight setter who adjusted for range and wind. The hull construction was ingenious, driven by the need for speed and the limitations of available materials. 2 layers of 1-inch mahogany planking were laid over white oak frames, with glue and brass screws holding everything together. Mahogany was chosen for its strength-to-weight ratio and its resistance to rot in tropical conditions. White oak frames provided structural strength. The double planking created a hull that was strong enough to handle the pounding of high-speed operation, but light enough to allow extraordinary speed. The boats had virtually no armor. The plywood hull would stop small arms fire, but nothing larger. A 20mm shell would punch through both sides of the hull. A 5-inch naval gun shell would blow a PT boat in half. The crew's only protection was speed and the cover of darkness. If a PT boat was caught in daylight by enemy aircraft or in an engagement with a warship, survival depended entirely on the skill of the crew and luck. Inside, conditions were Spartan and uncomfortable. The crew of 12 to 14 men worked in cramped quarters where everything was constantly soaked with spray. In rough seas, water would cascade over the bow and run down the deck, seeping into every opening. The crew would be drenched within minutes of getting underway. Salt water soaked into clothing and equipment. Metal corroded. Electrical systems shorted out. Charts became sodden and illegible. The forward area contained bunks for the crew, though calling them bunks was generous. They were narrow shelves with thin mattresses that were perpetually damp. In rough seas, trying to sleep was impossible. You would be thrown around despite any attempt to wedge yourself in place. Most crewmen learned to sleep in short bursts whenever possible, rather than trying to maintain any regular schedule. The galley was a joke, a small area with a tiny stove that was usually non-functional in rough seas. Meals consisted mostly of cold sandwiches, coffee when it could be made, and whatever canned rations were available. Fresh food was a luxury rarely available at forward bases. Fresh water was rationed. Bathing was done with salt water and special soap when soap was available. Most crewmen went days without proper washing. The head was literally a bucket, used at the stern, where the least modesty was maintained by the noise of the engines and the focus of other crew members on their duties. In rough seas, using the head became an adventure requiring good balance and a strong stomach.